Greetings. Hopefully my microphone is picking up, and also my and coming through to Twitch as well. Let's see if I can hear myself. I can. Hooray! Oh. Hi, Jem. Right, yes, judicious use of the phone to make sure I was broadcasting. Okay, I had to slightly rejig the setup, which is why my shoulders have been cut off, since I've had to move my stuff around, and therefore I can only get a green screen behind me in certain ways. So you have slightly cornered. Right. So today's I am still reading from the Giant Book of Vampires, as featured below. I am now, I would say, about a quarter of the way through. There is many vampire to come. This time I've actually been reading on in advance to make sure I know what content warnings to put in, which is why there are 2 bookmarks in the Giant Book of Vampires. One's for the bits I've checked so far, and one's for the bits I've got to on streams. Thank you. Yes, it is a nice waistcoat. I bought it for LARP, like so many other things I have. My wardrobe is full of LARP kit. So included in this week's stories are Edgar Allan Poe's Ligeia, Challenge Accepted, Johnny Sims. For context, Johnny Sims, when he was doing his the nice man whose voice you may hear on the Magnus Archives, specified that he would not be reading any Edgar Allan Poe for his excellent horror story reading out thing he's doing, because Edgar Allan Poe's prose is far too dense. He is entirely correct, and therefore I'm going to try anyway. Is there anything else I need to do? If you want content warnings, then there is Dracubot. There we go. And you may command him thus, CW for content warnings. So there are going to be, I'm going to read out 3 stories this stream, and I say 3 stories, 2 of them are stories, and one of them is a very, very short sort of kind of vibe piece, is the only way I can describe it. It's just there is a story contained within it, but it's only a couple of pages, and it's mostly impressions. So it's a 3 for 2 this time, because the middle one is very, very short. But since it's 3, that's a lot of content warnings. There's so many content warnings that Dracubot can't put them all in one post, so it has to spill across 2. Honestly, it's not the story I have read that's found the most content warnings yet. That's later on. That one had a lot, half a page of content warnings I wrote down. This probably isn't something I should be impressed by, but they are horror stories, I guess. Bonzo Gem, we did follow the House of Usher in my last year at uni, based in an abandoned chapel. It was very creepy. Yes, that is very creepy. It's nice when you can read the horrifying story in a horrifying setting. It's really helpful. I'm going to adjust my camera. Slightly downwards. There we go. Right. So content warnings I've done. Random gibberish I've done. So I will proceed on with the first story, which is Ligeia, by the aforementioned Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan Poe, 1809 to 1849, has been described as the father of modern horror. He was born in Boston to parents who were itinerant actors, but the death of his mother and the desertion of his father resulted in the 3-year-old Poe being made the ward of a Virginia merchant, who later disowned him. Expelled from the University of Virginia for not paying his gambling debts, and dismissed from the West Point Military Academy for deliberate neglect of duty, Poe finally embarked on a literary career. Poe, it seems like you couldn't stick at anything for any longer time, could you, lad? Bless you. He published a volume of poetry, Tamerlane, and other poems in 1827, but it wasn't until Poe wrote The Raven, 1845, that he became known as Mr. Poe the Poet. He suffered from bouts of depression and madness, and his state of mind is reflected in much of his fiction. Among his best stories are The Fall of the House of Usher, as previously mentioned in chat, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, The Black Cat, The Telltale Heart, The Pit in the Pendulum, The Premature Burial, and The Facts in the Case of Monsieur Valdemar. Poe's only novel, The Narrative of A. Gordon Pym, 1837, was left incomplete. Putting him up there with people like Geoffrey Chaucer for leaving things incomplete. Ligeia is rich in vampire imagery as the spirit of a dead woman tries to take possession of a living soul. It was filmed to great effect by Roger Corman in 1964 as The Tomb of Ligeia, starring Vincent Price. It's the law. if you say Vincent Price, you have to say his name like that. I don't make the words. And the will therein lieth, which dieth not. Who knoweth the mysteries of the will with its vigour? For God is but a great will, pervading all things, by nature of its intentness. Man doth not yield himself to the angels, nor unto death utterly, save only through the weakness of his feeble will. Joseph Glanvill. I cannot. Accent. I cannot, for my soul, remember how, when, or even precisely where I first became acquainted with the Lady Ligeia. Long years have since elapsed, and my memory is feeble through much suffering. Or perhaps I cannot now bring these points to mind, because in truth the character of my beloved, her rare learning, her singular yet placid cast of beauty, and the thrilling and enthralling eloquence of her low musical language made their way into my heart by paces so steadily and stealthily progressive that they have been unnoticed and unknown. It is indeed the law, yes. Yet I believe that I met her first, and most frequently, in some large, old, decaying city near the Rhine. Of her family I have surely heard her speak. That it is of a remotely ancient date cannot be doubted. Ligeia. Buried in studies of a nature more than all else adapted to deaden impressions of the outward world, it is by that sweet word alone, by Ligeia, that I bring before mine eyes and fancy the image of her who is no more. And now, while I write, a recollection flashes upon me that I have never known the paternal name of her who was my friend and my betrothed, and who became the partner of my studies, and finally the wife of my bosom. You didn't know her surname. All right. Was it a playful charge on the part of my Ligeia? Or was it a test of my strength of affection, that I should institute no inquiries upon this point? Or was it rather a caprice of my own, a wildly romantic offering on the shrine of the most passionate devotion? I but indistinctly recall the fact itself. What wonder that I have utterly forgotten the circumstances which originated or attended it? And indeed, if ever that spirit which is entitled romance, if ever she, the wan and misty-winged Ashtophet of idolatrous Egypt, presided, as they tell, over marriages ill-omened, then most surely she presided over mine. There is one dear topic, however, on which my memory fails me not. It is the person of Ligeia. Ashray. In stature she was tall, somewhat slender, and in her latter days even emaciated. I would in vain attempt to portray the majesty, the quiet ease of her demeanour, or the incomprehensible lightness and elasticity of her footfall. She came and departed as a shadow. I was never made aware of her entrance into my closed study, save by the dear music of her low, sweet voice, as she placed her marble hand upon my shoulder. In beauty of face, no maiden ever equalled her. It was the radiance of an opium dream, an airy and spirit-lifting vision, more wildly divine than the fantasies which hovered about the slumbering souls of the daughters of Delos. Yet her features were not of that regular mould which we have been falsely taught to worship in the classical labours of the heathen. There is no exquisite beauty, says Bacon, Lord Verulam, speaking truly of all the forms and genera of beauty, without some strangeness in the proportion. Yet, although I saw that the features of Ligeia were not of a classic regularity, although I perceived that her loveliness was indeed exquisite, and felt there was much of a strangeness pervading it, yet I have tried in vain to detect the irregularity and trace home my own perception of the strange. I examined the contour of the lofty and pale forehead. It was faultless. How cold indeed that word when applied to a majesty so divine. The skin rivaling the purest ivory, the commanding extent and repose, the gentle prominence of the regions above the temples, and then the raven black, the glossy, the luxuriant and naturally curling tresses, setting forth the full force of the Homeric epithet, hyacinthine. I looked at the delicate outlines of the nose, and nowhere, but in the graceful medallions of the Hebrews, had I beheld a similar perfection. There were the same luxurious smoothness of surface, the same scarcely perceptible tendency to the aquiline, the same harmoniously curved nostrils, speaking the free spirit. I regarded the sweet mouth. Here was indeed the triumph of all things heavenly, the magnificent turn of the short upper lip, the soft, voluptuous slumber of the under, the dimples which sported, and the colour which spoke, the teeth glancing back with a brilliancy almost startling. Every ray of the holy light which fell upon them in her serene and placid, yet most exultingly radiant of all smiles. I scrutinized the formation of the chin, and here too I found the gentleness of breadth, the softness and the majesty, the fullness and the spirituality of the Greek, the contour which the god Apollo revealed, but in a dream to Cleomenes, the son of the Athenian. And then I peered into the large eyes of Ligeia. For eyes we have no models in the remotely antique. It might have been, too, that in these eyes of my beloved lay the secret to which Lord Verulam alludes. They were, I must believe, far larger than the ordinary eyes of our own race. They were fuller even than the fullest of gazelle eyes of the tribes of the valley of Nourjahad. Yet it was only at intervals, in moments of intense excitement, that this peculiarity became more than slightly noticeable in Ligeia. At such moments was her beauty. In my heated fancy thus it appeared, perhaps, the beauty of beings either above or apart from the earth, the beauty of the fabulous houri of the turf. The hue of the orbs was the most brilliant of black, and far above them hung jetty lashes of great length. The brows, slightly irregular in outline, had the same tint. The strangeness, however, which I found in the eyes was of a nature distinct from the formation, or the colour, or the brilliancy of the features, and must, after all, be referred to as the expression. Ah, word of no meaning, behind whose vast latitude of mere sound we entrench our ignorance of so much of the spiritual. The expression in the eyes of Ligeia. How for long hours have I pondered upon it? How have I, through the whole of a midsummer night, struggled to fathom it? What was it? Had something more profound than the well of Democritus, which lay far within the pupils of my beloved. What was it? I was possessed with a passion to discover. Those eyes, those large, those shining, those divine orbs. They became to me twin stars of Leda, and I to them, devoutest of astrologers. There is no point, among the many incomprehensible anomalies of the science of the mind, more thrillingly exciting than the fact, never, I believe, noticed in the schools, that in our endeavours to recall to memory something long forgotten, we often find ourselves upon the very verge of remembrance, without being able in the end to remember. And thus, how frequently, in my intense scrutiny of Ligeia's eyes, have I felt approaching the full knowledge of their expression. Felt it approaching, yet not quite be mine, and so at length entirely depart. And strange, oh strangest mystery of all, I found in the commonest objects of the universe a circle of analogies to that expression. I mean to say that subsequently to the period when Ligeia's beauty passed into my spirit, there dwelling as in a shrine, I derived from many existences in the material world a sentiment, such as I felt always around, within me, by her large and luminous orbs. Yet, not the more could I define that sentiment, or analyze, or even steadily view it. I recognized it, let me repeat, sometimes in the survey of a rapidly growing vine, and the contemplation of a moth, a butterfly, a chrysalis, a stream of running water. I have felt it in the ocean, in the falling of a meteor. I have felt it in the glances of unusually aged people. And there are one or two stars in heaven, one especially a star of the 6th magnitude, double and changeable, to be found near the large star in Lyra, in a telescopic scrutiny of which I have been made aware of the feeling. I have been filled with it by certain sounds from stringed instruments, and not unfrequently by passages from books. Among innumerable other instances, I well remember something in a volume of Joseph Glanville, which, perhaps merely from its quaintness, who shall say, never failed to inspire me with the sentiment, and the will therein lieth which dieth not. Who knoweth the mysteries of the will, with its vigour? For God is but a great will, pervading all things by nature of its intentness. Man doth not yield him to the angels, or unto death utterly, save only through the weakness of his feeble will. Length of years and subsequent reflection have enabled me to trace indeed some remote connection between this passage in the English moralist and the portion of the character of Ligeia. An intensity of thought, action, or speech was possibly in her, a result, or at least an index of that gigantic volition which during our long intercourse failed to give other and more immediate evidence of its existence. Of all the women whom I have ever known, she, the outwardly calm, the ever placid Ligeia, was the most violently a prey to tumultuous vultures. Tumultuous vultures. Poe, you absolute lad. The tumultuous vultures of stern passion. And of that passion I could form no estimate save by the miraculous expansion of those eyes which at once so delighted and appalled me. by the almost magical melody, modulation, distinctness, and placidity of her very low voice, and by the fierce energy, rendered doubly effective by contrast with her matter of utterance, of the wild words which she habitually uttered. I have spoken of the learning of Ligeia. It was immense, such as I have never known in woman. In the classical tongues was she deeply proficient, and as far as my own acquaintance extended in regard to the modern dialects of Europe. Lovely. I have never known her at fault. Indeed, upon any theme of the most admired, because simply the most abstruse, of the boasted erudition of the Academy, have I ever found Ligeia at fault. How singularly, how thrillingly this one point in the nature of my wife has forced itself, at this late period only, upon my attention. I said her knowledge was such that I have never known in a woman. But where breathes the man who has traversed, and successfully, all the wide areas of moral, physical, and mathematical science? I saw not then, what I now clearly perceive, that the acquisitions of Ligeia were gigantic, were astounding, yet I was sufficiently aware of her infinite supremacy to resign myself with a childlike confidence to her guidance. Through the chaotic world of metaphysical investigation, in which I was most busily occupied during the earlier years of my marriage, that sentence went on for about 7 lines. With how vast a triumph, with how vivid a delight, with how much of all that is ethereal and hope did I feel, as she bent over me in studies, but little sought, but less known, that delicious vista by slow degrees expanding before me, down whose long, gorgeous, and all untrodden path I might at length pass onward to the goal of a wisdom too divinely precious, not to be forbidden. How poignant, then, must have been the grief with which, after some years, I beheld my well-grounded expectations take wings to themselves and fly away. Without Ligeia I was but as a child groping benighted. Her presence, her readings alone, rendered vividly luminous the many mysteries of the transcendentalism in which we were immersed. Wanting the radiant lustre of her eyes, letters, lambent and golden, grew duller than Saturnian lead, and now those eyes shone less and less frequently upon the pages over which I pored. Ligeia grew ill. The wild eyes blazed with a too glorious effulgence. The pale fingers became of the transparent waxen hue of the grave, when the blue veins upon the lofty forehead swelled and sank impetuously with the tides of the most gentle emotion. I saw that she must die, and I struggled desperately in spirit with the grim Azrael. And the struggles of the passionate wife were, to my astonishment, even more energetic than my own. There had been much in her stern nature to impress me with the belief that to her death would have come without its terrors. But not so. Words are impotent. Words are impotent to convey any just idea of the fierceness of resistance with which she wrestled with the shadow. The shadow is capitalized. The shadow. I groaned in anguish at the pitiable spectacle. I would have soothed, I would have reasoned, but in the intensity of her wild desire for life, solace and reason were alike the uttermost of folly. Yet not until the last instance, amid the most convulsive writhings of her fierce spirit, was shaken the external placidity of her demeanour. Her voice grew more gentle, grew more low, yet I would not wish to dwell upon the wild meaning of the quietly uttered words. My brain reeled as I hearkened, entranced to a melody more than mortal. Alliteration. To assumptions and aspirations which mortality had never before known. Assonance. That she loved me I should not have doubted, and I might have been easily aware that in a bosom such as hers love would have reigned no ordinary passion. But in death only was I fully impressed with the strength of her affection. For long hours, detaining my hand, would she pour out before me the overflowings of a heart whose more than passionate devotion amounted to idolatry. How had I deserved to be so blessed by such confessions? How had I deserved to be so cursed with the removal of my beloved in the hour of her making them? But upon this subject I cannot bear to dilate. I cannot bear to dilate, he says, having dilated for a good paragraph. Yet me say only that in Ligeia's more than womanly abandonment to a love, alas, all unmerited, all unworthily bestowed, I at length recognized the principle of her longing with so wildly earnest a desire for the life which was now fleeing so rapidly away. It is this wild longing, it is this eager vehemence of desire for life, but for life, that I have no power to portray, no utterance capable of expressing. At high noon of the night in which she departed, beckoning me peremptorily to her side, she bade me repeat certain verses composed by herself not many days before. I obeyed her. they were these. Lo, 'tis a gala night, within the lonesome latter years, an angel throng, bewinged, bedight in veils, and drowned in tears, sit in a theatre to see a play of hopes and fears, while the orchestra breathes fitfully the music of the spheres. Mimes, in the form of God on high, mutter and mumble low, and hither and thither fly, mere puppets they who come and go, at bidding of vast formless things that shift the scenery to and fro, flapping from out their condor wings, invisible woe. All caps, shadow. That motley drama, oh be sure, it shall not be forgot, with its phantom, chased forevermore by a crowd that sees it not, through a circle that ever returneth in to the self-same spot, and much of madness and more of sin and horror, the soul of the plot. But see, amid the mimic rout, a crawling shape intrude, a blood-red thing that writhes from out the scenic solitude. It writhes with mortal pangs, that mimes become its food, and the seraphs sob at vermin fangs, in human gore imbued. Out are the lights, out all, and over each a quivering form. The curtain, a funeral pall, comes down with the rush of a storm. And the angels, all pallid and wan, uprising and veiling, affirm that the play is the tragedy man, and its hero, the conqueror were. My ears getting me. Shadow. Oh God! Half-shrieked Ligeia, leaping to her feet and extending her arms aloft with spasmodic movement as I made an end of these lines. Oh God! Oh divine Father! Shall these things be undeviatingly so? Shall this conqueror be not once conquered? Are we not part and parcel in thee, who knoweth the mysteries of the will with its vigour? Man doth not yield him to the angels, nor unto death utterly, save only through the weakness of his feeble will. And now, as if exhausted with emotion, she suffered her white arms to fall and returned solemnly to her bed of death. And as she breathed her last sighs, there came mingled with them a low murmur from her lips. I bent to them my ear, and distinguished again the concluding words of the passage in Glanville. Man doth not yield him to the angels, nor to death utterly, save only through the weakness of his feeble will. She died, and I, crushed into the very dust with sorrow, could no longer endure the lonely desolation of my dwelling in the dim and decaying city by the Rhine. I had no lack of what the world calls wealth. Ligeia had brought me very far more, than ordinarily falls to the lot of mortals. After a few months, therefore, of weary and aimless wandering, I purchased and put in some repair an abbey which I shall not name, in one of the wildest and least frequented portions of fair England. Fascist Island. The gloomy and dreary grandeur of the building, the almost savage aspect of the domain, the many melancholy and time-honoured memories connected with both, had much in unison with the feelings of utter abandonment which had driven me into that remote and unsocial region of the country. Yet, although the external abbey, with its verdant decay hanging about it, suffered but little alteration, I gave way with a childlike perversity, and perchance with a faint hope of alleviating my sorrows, to a display of more than regal magnificence within. For such follies, even in childhood, I had imbibed a taste, and now they came back to me as if in the dotage of grief. Alas, I feel how much, even of incipient madness, might have been discovered in the gorgeous and fantastic draperies, in the solemn carvings of Egypt, in the wild cornices and furniture, in the bedlam patterns of the carpets of tufted gold. I had become a bounden slave in the trammels of opium, and my labours and my orders had taken a colouring from my dreams. But these absurdities I must not pause to detail. Again, Poe, you literally just paused to detail them. Let me speak only of that one chamber, ever accursed, whither, in a moment of mental alienation, I led from the altar as my bride, as the successor of the unforgotten Ligeia, the fair-haired and blue-eyed Lady Trina Trevanion of Tremaine. With a name like that, was Cornish. There is no individual portion of the architecture and decoration of that bridal chamber which is not now visibly before me. Where were the souls of the haughty family of the bride, when through thirst of gold they permitted me to pass the threshold of an apartment so bedecked, a maiden and a daughter so beloved? I have said that I minutely remember the details of the chamber, yet I am sadly forgetful on topics of deep moment. And here there was no system, no keeping in the fantastic display to take hold upon the memory. The room lay in a high turret of the castellated abbey, was pentagonal in shape and of capricious size. Occupying the whole southern face of the pentagon was the sole window, an immense sheet of unbroken glass from Venice, a single pane, and tinted of the leaden hue, so that the rays of either the sun or the moon passing through it fell with a ghastly lustre on the objects within. Over the upper portion of this huge window extended the trellis work of an aged vine, which clambered above the massy walls of the turret. The ceiling, of gloomy-looking oak, was excessively lofty, vaulted, and elaborately fretted with the wildest and most grotesque specimens of a semi-Gothic, semi-Druidical device. From out of the most central recesses of this melancholy vaulting depended by a single chain of gold, with long links, a huge censer of the same metal, Saracenic in pattern, and with many perforations so contrived that there writhed in and out of them, as if endued with a serpent vitality, a continual succession of parti-coloured fires. Some few ottomans and golden candelabra of Eastern figure were in the various stations about, and there was the couch, too, the bridal couch of an Indian model, and low, and sculptured of solid ebony with a pall-like canopy above. In each of the angles of the chamber stood on end a gigantic sarcophagus of black granite, from the tombs of the kings over against Luxor, with their aged lids full of immemorial sculpture. Wait, come on, man. Replicas, I hope. But in the draping of the apartment lay, alas, the chief fantasy of all. He spelt fantasy with a PH. The lofty walls, gigantic in height, even unproportionably so, were hung from summit to foot in vast folds with a heavy and massive-looking tapestry of a material which is found alike as a carpet on the floor, as a covering for the ottomans and the ebony bed, as a canopy for the bed, and as the gorgeous volutes of the curtains which partially shaded the window. The material was the richest cloth of gold. It was spotted all over, at irregular intervals with arabesque figures about a foot in diameter, and wrought upon the cloth in patterns of the most jetty black. But these figures partook of the true character of the arabesque only when regarded from a single point of view, by a contrivance no common, and indeed traceable to a very remote period of antiquity. They were made changeable in aspect. To one entering the room, they bore the appearance of simple monstrosities, but on a further advance, this appearance gradually departed, and step by step, as the visitor moved his station in the chamber, he saw himself surrounded by an endless succession of the ghastly forms which belonged to the superstitions of the Norman, or arise in the guilty slumbers of the monk. The phantasmagoric effect was vastly heightened by the artificial introduction of a strong, continual current of wind behind the draperies, giving a hideous and uneasy animation to the whole. Want to plug them gaps up, mate? In halls such as these, in a bridal chamber such as this, I passed with the Lady of Tremaine the unhallowed hours of the first month of our marriage, passed them with but little disquietude. That my wife dreaded the fierce moodiness of my temper, that she shunned me and loved me but little, I could not help perceiving. But it gave me pleasure, rather pleasure than otherwise. What a dick. I loathed her with a hatred belonging more to demon than to man. My memory flew back, oh, with what intensity of regret, to Ligeia, the beloved, the august, the beautiful, the entombed. I revelled in recollections of her beauty, of her wisdom, of her lofty, her ethereal nature, of her passionate, her idolatrous love. Now then did my spirit fully and freely burn with more than all the fires of her own. In the excitement of my opium dreams, for I was habitually fettered in the shackles of the drug, I would call aloud upon her name during the silence of the night, or among the sheltered recesses of the glens by day, as if through the wild eagerness, the solemn passion, the consuming ardour of my longing for the departed, I could restore her to the pathways she had abandoned. Ah, could it be forever upon the earth? Cut holes in the bridal chamber, yep. Let's see, we'll get some draft proofing in there, mate. Yeah, got a bit of a problem with these drafty old mysterious mansions in it. About the commencement of the second month of the marriage, the Lady Rowena was attacked with a sudden illness from which her recovery was slow, as it being married to a dickhead. The fever which consumed her rendered her nights uneasy, and in her perturbed state of half-slumber, she spoke of sounds and of motions in and about the chamber of the turret, which I included had no origin save in the distemper of her fancy. Or perhaps in the phantasmagoric influences of the chamber itself. Stop making me pronounce phantasmagoric, Poe. She became at length convalescent, finally well. Yet but a brief period elapsed, ere a second, more violent disorder again threw her upon a bed of suffering, and from this attack her frame, at all times feeble, never altogether recovered. Her illnesses were, after this epoch, of alarming character, and of more alarming recurrence, defying alike the knowledge and the great exertions of her physicians. With the increase of the chronic disease, which had thus apparently taken too sure hold upon her constitution to be eradicated by human means, I could not fail to observe a similar increase in the nervous irritation of her temperament, and in her excitability by trivial causes of fear. She spoke again, and now more frequently and pertinaciously of the slight sounds, and of the unusual motions among the tapestries to which she had formerly alluded. One night, near the closing in of September, she pressed this distressing subject with more than usual emphasis upon my attention. She had just awakened from an unquiet slumber, and I had been watching with feelings half of anxiety and half of vague... yeah. Marin, remember she was married to you, mate. Yeah. The workings of her emaciated countenance. I sat by the side of her ebony bed upon one of the ottomans of India. She partly arose, and spoke in an earnest low whisper of sounds which she then heard, which I could not hear, of motions which she then saw, but which I could not perceive. The wind was rushing hurriedly behind the tapestries, and I wished to show her what, let me confess, I could not at all believe, that those most inarticulate breathings and those very gentle variations of the figures upon the wall were but the natural effects of that customary rushing of the wind. But a deadly pallor overspreading her face had proved to me that my exertions to reassure her would be fruitless. She appeared to be fainting, and no attendants were within call. I remembered where was deposited a decanter of light wine which I had been ordered by her physicians, and hastened across the chamber to procure it. But as I stepped beneath the light of the censer, two circumstances of a startling nature attracted my attention. I had felt that some palpable, although invisible object had passed lightly by my person, and I saw that there lay upon the golden carpet in the middle of the rich lustre thrown from the censer a shadow, a faint, indefinite shadow of angelic aspect, such as might be fancied for the shadow of a shade. But I was wild. Sorry, phone's gone off. But I was wild with the excitement of an immoderate dose of opium, and heeded these things but little, nor spoke of them to Rowena. Having found the wine, I recrossed the chamber and poured out a gobletful, which I held to the lips of the fainting lady. She had now partially recovered, however, and took the vessel herself, while I sank upon an ottoman near me, with my eyes fastened upon her person. It was then that I became distinctly aware of a gentle footfall upon the carpet and near the couch, and in a second thereafter, as Rowena was in the act of raising the wine to her lips, I saw, or may have dreamed that I saw, fall within the goblet, as if for some invisible spring in the atmosphere of the room, 2, 3, or 4 large drops of a brilliant and ruby-coloured fluid. If this I saw, not so Rowena. She swallowed the wine unhesitatingly, and I forbore to speak to her of a circumstance which must, after all, I considered, have been but the suggestion of a vivid imagination, rendered morbidly active by the terror of the lady, by the opium, and by the hour. Mostly by the opium. Shadow. Yet I cannot conceal it from my own perception that immediately subsequent to the fall of the ruby drops, a rapid change for the worse took place in the disorder of my wife, so that on the 3rd subsequent night the hands of her menials prepared her for the tomb, and on the 4th I sat alone with her shrouded body in that fantastic chamber which I had received her as my bride. Wild visions, opium engendered, flitted, shadow-like before me. I gazed with unquiet eye upon the sarcophagi in the angles of the room, upon the varying figures of the drapery, and upon the writhing of the parti-coloured fires in the censer overhead. My eyes then fell, as I called to mind the circumstances of a former night, to the spot beneath the glare of the censer where I had seen the fainted traces of the shadow. It was there, however, no longer, and breathing with greater freedom, I turned my glances to the pallid and rigid figure upon the bed. Then rushed upon me 1,000 memories of Ligeia, and then came back upon my heart with the turbulent violence of a flood the whole of that unutterable woe with which I had regarded her thus enshrouded. The night waned, and still, with a bosom full of bitter thoughts of the one, only, and supremely beloved, I remained gazing upon the body of Rowena. It might have been midnight, or perhaps earlier, or later, for I had taken no note of time, when a sob, low, gentle, but very distinct, startled me from my reverie. I felt that it came from the bed of ebony, the bed of death. Shadow. I listened in an agony of superstitious terror, but there was no repetition of the sound. I strained my vision to detect any motion in the corpse, but there was not the slightest perceptible. Yet, I could not have been deceived. Could you, though? Could you, though? I had heard the noise, however faint, and my soul was awakened within me. I resolutely and perseveringly kept my attention riveted upon the body. Many minutes elapsed before any circumstance occurred, tending to throw light upon the mystery. At length it became evident that a very feeble and barely noticeable tinge of colour had flushed up within the cheeks, and along the sunken small veins of the eyelids. Through a species of unutterable horror and awe, for which the language of mortality has no sufficient energetic expression, I felt my heart cease to beat, my limbs grow rigid where I sat. Yet, a sense of duty finally operated to restore my self-possession. I could no longer doubt that we had been precipitated in our preparations, that Rowena still lived. It was necessary that some immediate exertion be made. Yet the turret was altogether apart from the portion of the abbey tenanted by the servants. There were none within call. I had no means of summoning them to my aid without leaving the room for many minutes, and this I could not venture to do. Get a bell, man. I therefore struggled alone in my endeavours to call back the spirit that was hovering. In a short period, it was certain, however, the relapse had taken place. The colour disappeared from both eyelid and cheek, leaving a wanness even more than that of marble. The lips became doubly shriveled and pinched up in the ghastly expression of death. A repulsive clamminess and coldness overspread rapidly the surface of the body, and all the usual rigorous stiffness immediately supervened. I fell back with a shudder upon the couch from which I had been so startlingly aroused, and again gave myself up to passionate waking visions of Ligeia. An hour thus elapsed, when, could it be possible, I was a second time aware of some vague sound issuing from the region of the bed. I listened in extremity of horror. The sound came again. It was a sigh. Rushing to the corpse, I distinctly saw, a tremor upon the lips. In a minute afterwards they relaxed, disclosing a bright line of the pearly teeth. Amazement now struggled in my bosom with the profound awe which had hitherto reigned there alone. I felt that my vision grew dim, my reason wandered. It was only by a violent effort that I at length succeeded in nerving myself to the task which duty thus once more had pointed out. There was now a partial glow upon the forehead, and upon the cheek and throat. Perceptibly... I know, right? Why are you so funny, Poe? You're not supposed to be funny. It's just because it's ridiculously overblown. There was now a partial glow upon the forehead, and upon the cheek and the throat. A perceptible warmth pervaded the whole frame. There was even a slight pulsation at the heart. The lady lived. And, with redoubled ardour, I betook myself to the task of restoration. I chafed and bathed the temples and the hands, and used every exertion which experience, and no little medical reading, could suggest. But in vain. Suddenly the colour fled, the pulsation ceased, the lips resumed the expression of the dead, and in an instant afterward the whole body took upon itself the icy chillness, the livid hue, the intense rigidity, the sunken outline, and all the loathsome peculiarities of that which has been, for many days, a tenant of the tomb. And again I sank into visions of Ligeia. And again, what marvel that I shudder while I write, again there reached my ears a low sob from the region of the ebony bed. Have you considered getting a servant now? Have you But why shall I minutely just I don't know, PM. Why shall I minutely detail the unspeakable horrors of that night? This is like the fifth time he was like, I cannot detail in any way the thing that I just detailed for 2 paragraphs. Why shall I pause to relate how... Well, you're gonna anyway, aren't you? Time after time, until the period of the Grey Dawn, this hideous drama of revivification was repeated. How each terrific relapse was only into a sterner and apparently more irredeemable death. How each agony wore the aspect of a struggle with some invisible foe, and how each struggle was succeeded by I know not what of wild change in the personal appearance of the corpse. Let me hurry to a conclusion. The greater part of the fearful night had worn away, and she who had been dead once again stirred, and now more vigorously than hitherto, although arousing from a dissolution more appalling in its utter hopelessness than any. I had long ceased to struggle or to move, and remained sitting rigidly upon the ottoman, a helpless prey to a whirl of violent emotions, of which extreme awe was perhaps the least terrible, the least consuming. The corpse, I repeat, stirred, and now more vigorously than before. The hues of life flushed up with unwonted energy into the countenance. The limbs relaxed, and save that the eyelids were yet pressed heavily together, and that the bandages and draperies of the grave still imparted their charnel character to the figure, I might have dreamed that Rowena had indeed shaken off utterly the fetters of death. Shadow. But if this idea was not even then altogether adopted, I could at least doubt no longer when arising from the bed, tottering with feeble steps, with closed eyes and with the manner of one bewildered in a dream, the thing that was enshrouded advanced boldly and palpably into the middle of the apartment. Hurrying to a conclusion, only all this paper prose. Actually, there's just a page left. We're good. I trembled not, I stirred not, for a crowd of unutterable fancies connected with the air, the stature, the demeanour of the figure, rushing hurriedly through my brain, and paralysed, had chilled me into stone. I stirred not, but gazed upon the apparition. There was a mad disorder in my thoughts, a tumult unappeasable. Could it indeed be the living Rowena who confronted me? Could it indeed be Rowena at all? The fair-haired, the blue-eyed Lady Rowena Trevanion of Tremaine. Why should I doubt it? The bandages lay heavily about the mouth. But then might it not be the mouth of the breathing Lady of Tremaine? And the cheeks. There were the roses, as in her noon of life. Yes, these might indeed be the fair cheeks of the living Lady of Tremaine. And the chin, with its dimples, as in health, might it not be hers? But had she then grown taller since her malady? Shadow. What inexpressible madness seized me with that thought? One bound, and I had reached her feet. Shrinking from my touch, she let fall from her head and loosened the ghastly cerements which had confined it, and there streamed forth, in the rushing atmosphere of the chamber, huge masses of long and dishevelled hair. It was blacker than the raven wings of midnight. And now slowly opened the eyes of the figure, which stood before me. Here then, at least, I shrieked aloud, can I never be mistaken? These are the full, and the black, and the wild eyes of my lost love, of the lady Ligeia. He did come to me, actually. It's probably the opium. Now it's Edgar Allan Poe's Ligeia. Well, Johnny was right. Shouldn't have done it. Learned my lesson. Okay? Right. I will now do Richard Christian Matheson's Vampire, which is blessedly 2 pages. And then I will have a break, and then I will go on to Stragella, which is a lot more colourful. And that was grey. Black. The wild eyes of my lost love. So, Richard Christian Matheson, Vampire. The son of acclaimed science fiction writer Richard Matheson, who I believe is the author of I Am Legend. Over the past few years, Richard Christian Matheson has proved himself to be the master of the short horror story. He's been an advertising copywriter, parapsychologist, rock and roll drummer, songwriter, television scriptwriter, and is now one of the hottest young producers in Hollywood. This was in 1992. He's co-executive producing a major vampire movie, Red Sleep, which he scripted with Mick Garris, marking his 6th sale of a screenplay written on speculation and sold for more than $500,000. He is also looking to direct one of his own original scripts within the next year or two. I feel like the editor actually had a conversation with him where he went, "Oh, I'm doing all this." As if all that wasn't enough, Matheson's early short stories were collected in Scars and Other Distinguishing Marks, and the second collection is due along with his first novel created by a psychological thriller set in Hollywood, which Clive Barker describes as a masterly fable. Vampire is the shortest story in this book. It is also one of the most powerful. Man. Late. Rain. Road. Man. Searching. Starved. Sick. driving. Radio, news, scanners, police, broadcast. Accident, town, near. Speeding, puddles, aching, minutes. Arrive, park, watch. Bodies, blood, crowd, sirens, wait. Hour, sit, pain, cigarette, thermos, coffee, sweat, nausea. Street lights, eyes, stretchers, sheets, flesh. Death. Shaking, chills. Clock. Wait. More. Wait. Car. Stink. Cigarette. Ambulance. Crying. Tow truck. Bodies taken. Crowd. Police. Photographers. Drunks. Leave. Gone. Street. Quiet. Rain. Dark. Humid. Alone. Door. Out. Stand. Walk. Pain. Stare. Closer. Buildings. Silent. Street. Dead. Blood. Chalk outlines. Closer. Step. Inside. Outlines. Middle. Inhale. Eyes closed. Think. Inhale. Concentrate. Feel. Breathe. Flow. Death. Collision. Woman screaming. Windshield. Expression. Moment. Death. Energy. Concentrate. Images. Exploding. Moment. Woman. Car. Truck. Explosion. Impact. Moment. Rush. Feeling. Feeding. Metal. Burning. Screams. Blood. Death. Moment. Collision. Images. Faster. Strength. Medicine. Stronger. Concentrate. Better. Images. Collision. Stronger. Seeing. Death. Moment. Healing. Moment. Addiction. Drug. Rush. Body. Warmer. Death. Concentrating. Healing. Addiction. Drug. Warm. Car. Death. Medicine. Death. Life. Medicine. Addiction. Strong. Leave. Car. Engine. Drive. Rain. Streets. Freeway. Map. Drive. Relax. Safe. Warm. Rush. Good. Radio. Cigarette. Breeze. Night. Searching. Accidents. Death. Life. Dash. Clock. Waiting. Soon. That is the unsettling, but blessedly short. Right. I shall go for a break now and get some water because somehow Poe has dried me out. Take your meds if you haven't remembered to. Hydrate. Eat something. Do all the self-care things you need to do. And I will be back shortly. Alright. I've had some water, eaten some cheese. Smoked cheese, which is quite nice. Okay, on to... no, that's not the right section. On to Hugh B. Cave's Stragella. Hope everybody's hydrated, eaten things, taken their meds, had a stretch, done whatever you do to unwind. And I shall proceed on. Hugh B. Cave was born in 1910 in Chester, England, but emigrated to America with his family when he was 5. Oh dear, Jim, you're very out of battery. While editing trade journals, he sold his first pulp magazine story, Island Ordeal, to Brief Stories in 1929. Cave quickly established himself as an inventive and prolific writer, and became a regular contributor to strange tales, weird tales, ghost stories, black book detective, thrilling mysteries, spicy mystery stories, and the so-called shudder pulps, horror stories and terror tales. Spicy. He then left the field for almost 3 decades, moving to Haiti and later Jamaica, where he established a coffee plantation and wrote 2 highly praised travel books, along with a number of mainstream novels. During this period, he also contributed fiction regularly to the Saturday Evening Post and other slick paper magazines. In 1977, Carl Edward Wagner's Carcosa imprint published a hefty volume of Cave's best horror tales, Mögenstrom and others, and he returned to the genre with stories in whispers and fantasy tales, followed by a string of modern horror novels, Legion of the Dead, The Nebulon Horror, The Evil, Shades of Evil, Disciples of Dread, The Lower Deep, and Lucifer's Eye. A new collection of short... I need to find more stuff by this guy, it sounds abysmally... I'm going to self-Google Hugh B. Cave. A new collection of shorter works, The Corpse Maker, edited by Sheldon Jaffrey, was recently issued by Stormont House, who also published a biography of by Audrey Parent, Pulp Man's Odyssey, the Hugh B. Cave story. In 1991, the Horror Writers of America presented Cave with their highest honour, the Lifetime Achievement Award. Stragella dates from Cave's most prolific period and is a classic vampire chiller written in the extravagant style of the pulp magazines of the 30s. Genuinely reminds me of Dark Place. yeah, put in the chat what you get if you Google him, Jam. I'm fascinated by this lad. Right, okay. What accent should I do it in? Should I do my terrible Edgar Allan Poe again, or? Sack it. I'll do my normal voice, and then if I come across something entertaining, I'll do an accent for it. Night, black as pitch, and filled with the wailing of a dead wind, sank like a shapeless spectre in the oily waters of the Indian Ocean, leaving a great grey expanse of sullen sea, empty except for a solitary speck. Yeah, no. That rose and dropped in the long swell. The forlorn thing was a ship's boat. For 7 days and 7 nights it had drifted through the waste, bearing its ghastly burden. Now, groping to his knees, one of the 2 survivors peered away into the east, where the first glare of a red sun filtered over the rim of the world. Within arm's reach, in the bottom of the boat, lay a second figure, face down. All night long he had lain there. Even the torrential shower, descending in the dark hours and flooding the dory with life-giving water, had failed to move him. Excuse me. The first man crawled forward. Scooping water out of the tarpaulin with a battered tin cup, he turned his companion over and forced the stuff through receded lips. "Miggs!" The voice was a cracked whisper. "Miggs! Good God, you ain't dead, Miggs! I ain't left alone out here!" John Miggs opened his eyes feebly. "What's wrong?" he muttered. "I've got water, Miggs! Water!" "You're dreaming again, Yancy. It ain't water. It's nothing but sea." "It rained! Last night it rained! I stretched the tarpaulin all night long. I've been lying face up, letting it rain in my mouth." Well. Miggs touched the tin cup to his tongue and lapped its contents suspiciously. With a mumbled cry, he gulped the water down. Then, gibbering like a monkey, he was crawling toward the tarpaulin. Yancy flung him back, snarling. "No, you won't!" Yancy rasped. "We've got to save it, see! We've got to get out of here!" Miggs glowered at him from the opposite end of the dory. Yancy sprawled down beside the tarpaulin and stared once again over the abandoned sea, struggling to reason things out. They were somewhere in the Bay of Bengal. A week ago, they had been aboard the Cardigan, a tiny tramp freighter, carrying its handful of passengers from Moulmein to Georgetown. The Cardigan had foundered in the typhoon off the Mergui archipelago. For 12 hours she had heaved and groaned through an inferno of swirling seas, and she had gone under. Yancy's memory of the succeeding events was a twisted and unreal parade of horrors. At first there had been 5 men in the little boat. 4 days of terrific heat, no water, no food, had driven the little Persian priest mad, and he had jumped overboard. The other 2 had drunk salt water and died in agony. Now he and Miggs were alone. The sun was incandescent in a white-hot sky. The sea was calm, greasy, and broken except for the slow, patient black fins that had been following the boat for days. But something else, during the night, had joined the sharks in their hellish pursuit. Sea snakes. Hydrophinae? I can't pronounce that. Wriggling out of nowhere, had come to haunt the dory, gliding in circles round and round, venomous, vivid, vindictive. See, this guy likes his alliteration just as much as Poe does. And overhead were gulls wheeling, swooping in erratic arcs, cackling fiendishly, and watching the 2 men with relentless eyes. "Seagulls, my old enemy!" Yancy glanced up at them. Gulls and snakes could mean only one thing, land. He supposed they had come from the Andamans, the prison isles of India. It didn't much matter, they were here, hideous, menacing, harbingers of hope. His shirt, filthy and ragged, hung open to the belt, revealing a lean chest tattooed with grotesque figures. A long time ago, too long to remember, he'd gone on a drunken binge in Goa. Content warning, Slayer here. Jack Brum had done it. In company with the other two others of the Cardigan's crew, he had shambled into a tattooing establishment and ordered the Jap, in a bloated voice, to paint anything you damn well like, Professor. Anything at all. And the Jap, being of a religious mind and sentimental, had decorated Yancy's chest with the most beautiful crucifix, large, ornate and colourful. It brought a grim smile to Yancy's lips as he peered down at it. But presently his attention was centred on something else, something unnatural, bewildering on the horizon. The thing was a narrow bank of fog lying low on the water, as if a distorted cloud had sunk out of the sky, and was floating heavily, half submerged in the sea. And the small boat was drifting towards it. In a little while, the fog bank hung dense on all sides. Yancy groped to his feet, gazing about him. John Miggs muttered something beneath his breath and crossed himself. The thing was shapeless, greyish-white, clammy. It reeked not with the dank smell of sea fog, but with a sickly, pungent stench of a buried jungle or subterranean mushroom cellar. The sun seemed unable to penetrate it. Yancy could see the red ball above him, A feeble, smothered eye of crimson fire blotted by swirling vapour. "Gulls," mumbled Miggs. "They're gone." "I know it. The sharks too, and the snakes. We're all alone, Miggs." An eternity passed while the dory drifted deeper and deeper into the cone. And then there was something else, something that came like a moaning voice out of the fog. Yeah, that was the crucifix tattoo was foreshadowing there a little bit. Yeah. Chekhov's tattoo. The muted, irregular sing-song clangor of a ship's bell. "Listen!" Miggs cackled. "You hear that?" But Yancey's trembling arm had come up, pointing ahead. "By God, Miggs, look!" Miggs scrabbled up, rocking the boat beneath him. His bony fingers gripped Yancey's arm. They stood there, the two of them, staring at the massive black shape that loomed up like an ethereal phantom of another world 100 feet before them. "It's saved!" Miggs said incoherently. "Thank God! Nels—" Yancey called out shrilly. His voice rang through the fog with a hoarse jangle like the scream of a caged tiger. It choked into silence, and there was no answer, no responsive outcry, nothing so much as a whisper. The dory drifted closer. No sound came from the lips of the two men as they drew alongside. There was nothing but the intermittent tolling of that mysterious, muted bell. Then they realised the truth that brought a moan from Miggs's lips. The thing was a derelict, frowning out of the water, inanimate, sullen, buried in its winding sheet of unearthly fog. Its stern was high, exposing a propeller red with rust and matted with clinging weeds. Across the bow, nearly obliterated by age, appeared the words, "Golconda, Cardiff." "Yancey, it ain't no real ship. It ain't of this world." Yancey stooped with a snarl and picked up the oar in the bottom of the dory. A rope dangled within reach, hanging like a black serpent over the scarred hull. You found the Wikipedia article for Hugh BK. Okay, cool. Shall look at that later. A rope dangled within reach, hanging like a black serpent over the scarred hull. With clumsy strokes, he drove the small boat beneath it and reached up. He seized the line and made the boat fast. You're going aboard?" Miggs said fearfully. Yancey hesitated, staring up with bleary eyes. He was afraid without knowing why. The Golconda frightened him. The mist clung to her tenaciously. She rolled heavily, ponderously in the long swell, and the bell was still tolling softly somewhere within the lost vessel. "Well, why not?" Yancey growled. "There might be food aboard. What's there to be afraid of?" Miggs was silent. Grasping the ropes, Yancey clambered up them. His body swung like a gibbet corpse against the side. Clutching the rail, he heaved himself over, then stood there peering into the layers of thick fog as Miggs climbed up and dropped down beside him. "I don't like it," Miggs whispered. "It ain't." Yancey groped forward. The deck planks creaked dismally under him. With Miggs clinging close, he led the way into the waist, then into the bow. The cold fog seemed to have accumulated here in a sluggish mass as if some magnetic force had drawn it. Through it, with arms outheld in front of him, Yancey moved with shuffling steps, a blind man in a strange world. Suddenly he stopped so abruptly that Miggs lurched headlong into him. Yancey's body stiffened. His eyes were wide, glaring at the deck before him. A hollow, unintelligible sound parted his lips. Miggs cringed back with a livid screech clawing at his shoulder. "What is it?" he said thickly. At their feet were bones, skeletons lying there in the swirl of vapour. Yancey shuddered as he examined them. Dead things they were, dead and harmless, yet they were given new life by the motion of the mist. They seemed to crawl, to slither, to wriggle towards him and away from him. He recognised some of them as portions of human frames. Others were weird, unshapely things. A tiger skull grinned up at him with jaws that seemed to widen hungrily. The vertebrae of a huge python lay in disjointed coils on the planks, twisted as if in agony. He discerned the skeletonic remains of tigers, tapirs, and jungle beasts of unknown identity, and human heads, many of them scattered about like an assembly of mocking, dead-alive faces leering at him, watching him with hellish anticipation. The place was a morgue, a charnel house. Yancey fell back, stumbling. His terror had returned with triple intensity. He felt cold perspiration forming on his forehead, on his chest, trickling down the tattooed crucifix. Frantically, he swung about in his tracks and made for the welcome solitude of the stern deck, only to have Miggs clutch feverishly at his arm. "I'm going to get out of here, Nels. That damn bell. These here things." Yancey flung the groping hands away. He tried to control his terror. The ship, this Golconda, was nothing but a tramp trader. She had been carrying a cargo of jungle animals for some expedition. The beast had got loose, gone amuck in a storm. There was nothing fantastic about it. In answer came the intermittent clang of the hidden bell below decks and the soft lapping sound of the water swishing through the thick weeds which clung to the ship's bottom. "Come on," Yancey said grimly. "We'll go and have a look around. We need food." He strode back through the waist of the ship, with Miggs shuffling behind. Feeling his way to the towering stern, he found the fog thinner, less pungent. The hatch leading down into the stern hold was open. It hung before his face like an uplifted hand, scarred, bloated, as if in mute warning. And out of the aperture at its base straggled a spidery thing that was strangely out of place here on this abandoned derelict. A curious, menacing, crawling vine with mottled triangular leaves and immense orange-hued blossoms. Perfectly not. Yeah. Stuff grows on boats all the time. It's fine. It's absolutely fine. Like a living snake intertwined about itself, it coiled out of the hold and wormed over the deck. Yancey stepped closer, hesitantly, bending down. He reached to grasp one of the blooms, only to turn his face away and fall back with an involuntary mutter. The flowers were sickly sweet, nauseating. They repelled him with their savage odour. "Something," Miggs whispered sibilantly, "is watching us, Nels. I can feel it." Yancey peered all about him. He too felt a third presence close at hand, something malignant, evil, unearthly. He could not name it. "It's your imagination," he snapped. "Shut up, will you?" "We ain't alone, Nels. This ain't no ship at all." "Shut up." "But the flowers, they ain't right. Flowers don't grow aboard a Christian ship, Nels." "This hulk's been here long enough for trees to grow on it," Yancey said curtly. "Seeds probably took root in the filth below." "Well, I don't like it." "Go forward and see what you can find. I'm going below to look around." Pungent fog. Pungent fog is what they called me. And nope. Bloody vultures. "Go forward and see what you can find. I'm going below to look around." Miggs shrugged helplessly and moved away. Alone, Yancey descended to the lower levels. It was dark down here, full of shadows, and huge gaunt forms that lost their substance in the coils of thick, sinuous fog. Sinuous fog is what they called me in. Yeah. He felt his way along the passage, pawing the wall with both hands. Deeper and deeper into the labyrinth he went until he found the galley. The galley was a dungeon, reeking of dead, decayed food, as if the stench had hung there for an eternity without being molested, as if the entire ship lay in an atmosphere of its own, an atmosphere of the grave, through which the clean outer air never broke. But there was food here, canned food that stared down at him from the rotted shelves. The labels were blurred, illegible. Some of the cans crumbled in Yancey's fingers as he seized them, disintegrated into brown, dry dust and trickled to the floor. Others were in fair condition, airtight. He stuffed 4 of them into his pockets and turned away. Eagerly now he stumbled back along the passage. The prospect of food took some of those other thoughts out of his mind, and he was in better humour when he finally found the captain's cabin. Here, too, the evident age of the place gripped him. The walls were grey with mould, falling into a broken, warped floor. A single table stood on the far side near the bunk, a blackened, grimy table bearing an upright oil lamp and a single black book. He picked the lamp up timidly and shook it. The circular base was yet half full of oil, and he set it down carefully. It would come in handy later. Frowning, he peered at the book beside it. It was a seaman's Bible, a small one lying there coated with cracked dust, dismal with age. Around it, as if some crawling slug had examined it on all sides, leaving a trail of excretion. Time for slate. Lay a peculiar line of black pitch, irregular but unbroken. Yancey picked the book up and flipped it open. The pages slid under his fingers, allowing a scrap of loose paper to flutter to the floor. He stopped to retrieve it, then, seeing that it bore a line of pencilled script, he peered closely at it. The writing was an apparently irrelevant scrawl, a meaningless memorandum that said crudely, "It's the bats and the crates. I know it now, but it is too late. God help me!" With a shrug he replaced it and thrust the Bible into his belt, where it pressed comfortingly against his body. Then he continued his exploration. In the wall cupboard he found 2 full bottles of liquor, which proved to be brandy. Leaving them there, he groped out of the cabin and returned to the upper deck in search of Miggs. Miggs was leaning on the rail, watching something below. Yancey trudged towards him, calling out shrilly, "Say, I got food, Miggs. Food and He did not finish. Mechanically, his eyes followed the direction of Miggs's stare, and he recoiled involuntarily as his words clipped into stifled silence. On the surface of the oily water below, huge sea snakes paddled against the ship's side, enormous slithering shapes banded with streaks of black and red and yellow, vicious and repulsive. "They're back," Miggs said quickly. "They know this ain't no proper ship. They're coming out of their hellhole to wait for us." Yancey glanced at him curiously. The inflection of Miggs's voice was peculiar. Not at all the phlegmatic, guttural tone that normally grumbled through the man's lips. It was almost eager. "What did you find?" Yancey faltered. "Nothing. All the ship's boats are hanging in their davits. Never been touched." "I found food," Yancey said abruptly, gripping his arm. "We'll eat, and then we'll feel better. What the hell are we, anyhow? A couple of fools? As soon as we eat, we'll stop the door and get off this blasted death ship. Clear out this stinking fog. We've got water in the tarpaulin." "We'll clear out, will we, Nels?" "Yeah, let's eat." Once again, Yancey led the way below decks to the galley. There, after a 20-minute effort in building a fire in the rusty stove, he and Miggs prepared a meal, carrying the food into the captain's cabin, where Yancey lighted the lamp. They ate slowly, sucking the taste hungrily out of every mouthful, reluctant to finish. The lamplight flickering in their faces made gaunt masks of features that were already haggard and full of anticipation. The brandy, which Yancey fetched out of the cupboard, brought back strength and reason and confidence. It brought back, too, that unnatural sheen to Miggs's twitching eyes. We'd be damn fools to clear out here right off," Miggs said suddenly. "The fog's got to lift sooner or later. I ain't trusting myself to no small boat again, Nels. Not when we don't know where we're at." Yancey looked at him sharply. The little man turned away with a guilty shrug, then hesitantly, "I kind of like it here, Nels." Yancey caught the odd gleam in those small eyes. He bent forward quickly. "Where'd you go when I left you alone?" he demanded. "Me? I didn't go nowhere. I just looked around a bit. I picked a couple of them flowers, see?" Miggs groped in his shirt pocket and held up one of the livid, orange-coloured blooms. His face took on an unholy brilliance as he held the thing close to his lips and inhaled its deadly aroma. His eyes, glittering across the table, were on fire with sudden fanatic lust. For an instant Yancey did not move. Then, with a savage oath, he lurched up and snatched the flower out of Miggs's fingers. Whirling, he flung it to the floor and ground it under his boot. "You damn thick-headed fool!" he screeched. You, God help you!" Then he went limp, muttering incoherently. With faltering steps, he stumbled down to the cabin, and along the black passageway, and onto the abandoned deck. He staggered to the rail and stood there, holding himself erect with nerveless hands. "God," he whispered hoarsely. "God, what did I do that for? Am I going crazy?" No answer came out of the silence, but he knew the answer. The thing he had done down there in the skipper's cabin, those mad words that had spewed from his mouth, had been involuntary. Something inside him, some sense of danger that was all about him, had hurled the words out of his mouth before he could control them, and his nerves were on edge too. They felt as though they were ready to crack. Shadow. But he knew instinctively that Miggs had made a terrible mistake. Yeah, alcohol. Bad idea. Opium. Bad idea. All these things. Bad idea. Makes the horror worse. There was something unearthly and wicked about the sickly sweet flowers. Flowers didn't grow aboard ship. Not real flowers. Real flowers had to take root somewhere, and besides, they shouldn't have that drunken, etherish odour. Miggs should have left the vine alone. Clinging at the rail there, Yancey knew it without knowing why. He stayed there for a long time, trying to think, get his nerves back again. In a little while, he began to feel frightened being alone and returned below decks to the cabin. He stopped in the doorway and stared. Miggs was still there, slumped grotesquely over the table. The bottle was empty. Miggs was drunk, unconscious, mercifully oblivious of his surroundings. For a moment, Yancey glared at him morosely. For a moment, too, a new fear tugged at Yancey's heart. Fear of being left alone through the coming night. He yanked at Miggs's arm and shook him savagely, but there was no response. It would be hours, long, dreary, sinister hours, before Miggs regained his senses. Bitterly, Yancey took the lamp and set about exploring the rest of the ship. If he could find the ship's papers, he considered, they might dispel his terror. He might learn the truth. With this in mind, he sought the mate's quarters. The papers had not been in the captain's cabin where they belonged, therefore they might be here. But they were not. There was nothing but a chronometer, sextant, and other nautical instruments lying in curious positions on the mate's table, rusted beyond repair. And there were flags, signal flags, red flags perhaps, no, thrown down as if they had been used at the last moment. And lying in a distorted heap on the floor was a human skeleton. Avoiding this last horror, Yancey searched the room thoroughly. Evidently, he reasoned the captain had died early in the Golconda's unknown plague. The mate had brought these instruments, these flags, to his own cabin, only to succumb before he could use them. Only one thing Yancey took with him when he went out. A lantern, rusty and brittle, but still serviceable. It was empty, but he poured oil into it from the lamp. Then, returning the lamp to the captain's quarters, where Miggs lay unconscious, he went on deck. He climbed the bridge and set the lantern beside him. Night was coming. Already the fog was lifting, allowing darkness to creep in beneath it. And so Yancey stood there alone and helpless, while blackness settled with uncanny quickness over the entire ship. He was being watched. He felt it. Invisible eyes, hungry and menacing, were keeping check on his movements. On the deck beneath him were those inexplicable flowers, trailing out of the unexplored hold, glowing like phosphorescent faces in the gloom. By God, Yancey mumbled, "We're going to get out of here." His own voice startled him and caused him to stiffen and peer about him as if someone else had uttered the words. And then, very suddenly, his eyes became fixed on the far horizon to starboard. His lips twitched open, spitting out a shrill cry. "Miggs! Miggs! A light! Look, Miggs!" Frantically he stumbled down from the bridge and clawed his way below decks to the mate's cabin. Feverishly he seized the signal flags. Then, clutching them in his hand, he moaned helplessly and let them fall. He realised they were no good in the dark. Gibbering to himself, he searched for rockets. There were none. Suddenly he remembered the lantern. Back again he raced through the passage on deck, up on the bridge. In another moment, with the lantern dangling from his arm, he was clambering higher and higher into the black spars of the mainmast. Again and again he slipped and caught himself with outflung hands, and at length he stood high above the deck, feet braced, swinging the lantern back and forth. Below him the deck was no longer silent, no longer abandoned. From bow to stern it was trembling, creaking, whispering up at him. He peered down fearfully. Blurred shadows seemed to be prowling through the darkness, coming out of nowhere, pacing dolefully back and forth throughout the gloom. They were watching him with a furtive interest. He called out feebly. The muted echo of his own voice came back up to him. He was aware that the bell was tolling again, and the swish of the sea was louder, more persistent. With an effort he caught a grip on himself. "Damn fool," he rasped, "driving yourself crazy." The moon was rising. It blurred the blinking light on the horizon and penetrated the darkness like a livid yellow finger. Yancey lowered the lantern with a sob. It was no good now. In the glare of the moonlight, this puny flamer would be invisible to the men aboard that other ship. Slowly, cautiously, he climbed down to the deck. He tried to think of something to do to take his mind off the fear. Striding to the rail, he hauled up the water butts from the dory. Then he stretched the tarpaulin to catch the precipitation of the night dew. No telling how long he and Miggs would be forced to remain aboard this hulk. He turned again to explore the forecastle. On his way across the deck, he stopped and held the light over the creeping vine. The curious flowers had become fragrant, heady, with the fumes of an intoxicating drug. He followed the coils to where they vanished into the hold and looked down. He saw only a tumbled pile of boxes and crates. Barred boxes, which must have been cages at some one time. Again, he turned away. The ship was trying to tell him something. He felt it. Felt the movements of the deck planks beneath his feet. The moonlight, too, had made hideous white things of the scattered bones in the bow. Yancey stared at them with a shiver. He stared again, and grotesque thoughts obtruded into his consciousness. The bones were moving, slithering, sliding over the deck, assembling themselves, gathering into definite shapes. He could have sworn it. Cursing, he wrenched his eyes away. Damn fool, thinking such thoughts. With clenched fists he advanced to the forecastle. But before he reached it, he stopped again. It was the sound of flapping wings that brought him about. Turning quickly with a jerk, he was aware that the sound emanated from the open hold. Hesitantly he stepped forward, and stood rigid with an involuntary scream. Out of the aperture came two horrible shapes, two inhuman things with immense clapping wings and glittering eyes. Hideous, enormous bats. Instinctively he flung up his arm to protect himself, but the creatures did not attack. They hung for an instant, poised over the hatch, eyeing him with something that was fiendishly like intelligence. Then they flapped over the deck, over the rail, and away into the night. As they sped towards the west, where he had seen the light of that other ship twinkling, they clung together like witches, hell-bent on some evil mission. And below them in the bloated sea, huge snakes weaved smoky golden patterns. waiting. He stood fast, squinting after the bats. Like two hellish black eyes, they grew smaller and smaller, became pinpoints in the moonglow, and finally vanished. Still, he did not stir. His lips were dry, his body stiff and unnatural. Actually, to be honest, so am I. With you there, Yancy, mate? He licked his mouth. Then he was conscious of something more. From somewhere behind him came a thin, throbbing thread of harmony, a lovely and utterly sweet musical note that fascinated him. He turned slowly. His heart was hammering, surging. His eyes went suddenly wide. There, not 5 feet from him, stood a human form. Not his imagination. Real. But he had never seen a girl like her before. Never seen a girl like you before. 'Cause you're undead. She was too beautiful. She was wild, almost savage, with her great dark eyes boring into him. Her skin was white, smooth as alabaster. Her hair was jet black, and a waving coil of it, like a broken cobweb of pitch strings, framed her face. Grotesque hoops of gold dangled from her ears. In her hair above them gleamed 2 of those sinister flowers from the straggling vine. Ligeia, but, pound shop Ligeia. Big old gold hoops. He did not speak, he simply gaped. The girl was barefooted and bare-legged. A short, dark skirt covered her slender thighs. A ragged white waist open at the throat revealed the full curve of her breast. In one hand, she held a long wooden reed, a flute-like instrument fashioned out of crude wood, and about her middle, dangling almost to the deck, twined a scarlet silken sash, brilliant as the sun, but not so scarlet as her lips, which were parted in a faint, suggestive smile, showing teeth of marble whiteness. Who are you? Nancy mumbled. She shook her head. Yet she smiled with her eyes, and he felt somehow that she understood him. He tried again in such tongues as he knew. Still she shook her head, and still he felt that she was mocking him. Not until he chanced upon a scattered, faltering greeting in Serbian did she nod her head. Dobra, she replied in a husky, rich voice, which sounded somehow as if it was rarely used. He stepped closer then. She was a gypsy, evidently. A Tsanye of the Serbian hills. She moved very close to him, with a floating, almost ethereal movement of her slender body. Peering into his face, flashing her haunting smile at him, she lifted the flute-like instrument and, as if it were nothing at all unnatural, out of place, began to play again, the song which had first attracted his attention. He listened in silence until she had finished. Then, with a cunning smile, she touched her fingers to her lips and whispered softly, You? Mine? Yes? He did not understand. She clutched his arm and glanced fearfully toward the west, out over the sea. You? Mine? She said fiercely. Papa Bosito. I don't know how to pronounce that C in this. Let's go with Papa Bosito. Serafino. They no have you. You not go to them. He thought he understood then. She turned away from him and went silently across the deck. He watched her disappear into the forecastle and would have followed her, but once again the whole ship seemed to be struggling to whisper a warning. Presently she returned, holding in her white hand a battered silver goblet, very old and very tarnished, brimming with scarlet fluid. He took it silently. It was impossible to refuse her. Her eyes had grown into lakes of night lit by the burning moon. Her lips were soft, searching, undeniable. Who are you? He whispered. Stragella, she smiled. Stragella. Stragella. The name itself was compelling. He drank the liquid slowly without taking his eyes from her lovely face. The stuff had the taste of wine, strong, sweet wine. It was intoxicating, with the same weird effect that was contained in the orange blooms which she wore in her hair, which grovelled over the deck behind her. Yancey's hands groped up weakly. He rubbed his eyes, feeling suddenly weak, powerless, as if the very blood had been drained from his veins. Struggling futilely, he staggered back, moaning half inaudibly. Stragella's arms went about him, caressing him with sensuous touch. He felt them, and they were powerful, irresistible. The girl's smile maddened him. Her crimson lips hung before his face, drawing nearer, mocking him. Then all at once she was seeking his throat. Those warm, passionate, deliriously pleasant lips were searching to touch him. He sensed his danger. Frantically, he strove to lift his arms and push her away. Deeper in his mind, some struggling intuition, some half-alive idea warned him that he was in terrible peril. This girl, Stragella, was not of his kind. She was a creature of the darkness, a denizen of a different, frightful world of her own. Those lips, wanting his flesh, were inhuman, too fervid. Suddenly she shrank away from him, releasing him with a jerk, and a snarling, animal-like sound surged from her flaming mouth. Her hand lashed out, rigid, pointing to the thing that hung in his belt. Tonic fingers pointed to the Bible that defied her. But the scarlet fluid has taken its full effect. Yancey slumped down, unable to cry out. In a heap he lay there, paralysed and powerless to stir. He knew that she was commanding him to rise. Her lips, moving in a pantomime, formed soundless words. Her glittering eyes were fixed upon him, hypnotic. The Bible. She wanted him to cast it over the rail. She wanted him to stand up and go into her arms. Then her lips would find a hold. But he could not obey. He could not raise his arms to support himself. She, in turn, stood at bay and refused to advance. Then, whirling about, her lips drawn into a diabolical curve, beautiful but bestial, she retreated. He saw her dart back, saw her tapering body whip about with the crimson sash outflung behind her as she raced across the deck. Yancey closed his eyes to blot out the sight. Then, when he opened them again, they opened to a new and more intense horror. On the Golconda's deck, Stragella was darting erratically among those piles of gleaming bones, but they were bones no longer. They had gathered into shapes, taken on flesh and blood. Before his very eyes they assumed substance, men and beasts alike, and then began an orgy such as Nels Yancey had never before looked upon. An orgy of the undead. Shadow. Monkeys, giant apes lunged about the deck. A huge python reared its sinuous head to glare. On the hatch cover, a snow leopard, snarling furiously, crouched to spring. Tigers, tapirs, crocodiles fought together in the bow. A great brown bear of the type found in the lofty plateaus of the Pamirs clawed at the rail. And the men, most of them were dark-skinned, dark enough to have come from the same region, from Madras. With them crouched Chinamen, some Anglo-Saxons, starved, all of them, lean, gaunt, mad. Pandemonium raged then. Animals and men alike were insane with hunger. In a little struggling knot. Yes, amazing line. An orgy of the undead. Animals and men alike were insane with hunger. In a little struggling knot, the men were gathered about the number 2 hatch, defending themselves. They were wielding firearms, firing point blank, with desperation into the writhing mass that confronted them. And always, between them, and around them, and among, darted the girl who called herself Stragella. They cast no shadows, those ghost shapes, not even the girl whose arms he had felt about him only a moment ago. There was nothing real in the scene, nothing human. Even the sounds of the shots and the screams of the cornered men, even the roaring growls of the big cats were smothered, as if they came to him through heavy glass windows from a sealed chamber. He was powerless to move. He lay in a cataleptic condition, conscious of the entire pantomime, yet unable to flee from it. And his senses were horribly acute. So acute that he turned his eyes upward with an abrupt twitch, instinctively, and then shrank into himself with a new fear, as he discerned the 2 huge bats which had winged their way across the sea. They were returning now. Circling above him, they flapped down one after the other and settled with heavy, sullen thuds upon the hatch, close to that weird vine of flowers. They seemed to have lost their shape, these nocturnal monstrosities, to have become fantastic blurs enveloped in an earthly bluish radiance. Even as he stared at them, they vanished altogether for a moment, and then the strange vapour cleared to reveal the 2 creatures who stood there. Not bats, humans. Inhumans. They were gypsies, attired in mouldy, decayed garments that stamped them as Balkans. Man and woman. Lean, emaciated, ancient man with fierce white moustache. Plump old woman with black, rat-like eyes that seemed unused to the light of day. And they spoke to Stragella. Spoke to her eagerly. She, in turn, swung about with an enraged face and pointed to the Bible in Yancey's belt. But the pantomime was not finished. On the deck, the men and animals lay moaning and sobbing. Stragella turned noiselessly, calling the old man and old woman after her, calling them by name. Come, Papa Bosito, Serafina. The tragedy of the ghost ship was being reenacted. Yancey knew it and shuddered at the thought. Starvation, cholera had driven the Golconda's crew mad. The jungle beasts, unfed, hideously savage, had escaped out of their confinement. And now that final conflict was over, Stragella and Papa Bosito and Serafina were proceeding about their ghastly work. Stragella was leading them. Her charm, her beauty gave her a hold on the men. They were in love with her. She had made them love her, madly and without reason. Now she was moving from one to another, loving them and holding them close to her, and as she stepped away from each man, he went limp, faint, while she laughed terribly and passed on to the next. Her lips were parted. She licked them hungrily, licked the blood from them with a sharp crimson tongue. How long it lasted, Yancey did not know. Hours on end. He was aware suddenly that the high wind was screeching and wailing in the upper reaches of the ship, and peering up he saw that the spars were no longer bare and rotten with age. Great grey sails stood out against the black sky, fantastic things without any definite form or outline, and the moon above them had vanished utterly. The howling wind was bringing a storm with it, filling the sails to bulging proportions. Beneath the decks, the ship was groaning like a creature in agony. The seas were lashing her, slashing her, carrying her forward with amazing speed. All of a sudden came a mighty grinding sound. The Golconda hurtled back as if a huge jagged reef or submerged rock had bored into her bottom. She listed. Her stern rose high in the air, and Stragella, with her two fellow fiends, was standing in the bow, screaming in mad laughter in the teeth of the wind. The other two laughed with her. Yancey saw them turn towards him, but they did not stop. Somehow he did not expect them to stop. This scene, this mad pantomime, was not the present. It was the past. It was not here at all. All this had been happened years ago, forgotten, buried in the past. But he heard them talking in a Mongol dialect full of Serbian words. "It is done, Papabosito. We shall stay here forever now. There is land within an hour's flight where fresh blood abounds and will always abound. And here on this wretched hulk they will never find our graves to destroy us." The horrible trio passed close. Stragella turned to stare out across the water and raised her hands in silent warning. Yancey, turning wearily to stare in the same direction, saw that the first streaks of daylight were beginning to filter over the sea. With a curious, floating, drifting movement, the three undead creatures moved towards the open hatch. They descended out of sight. Yancey, jerking himself erect and surprised to find that the effect of the drug had worn off with the coming of dawn, crept to the hatch and peered down, in time to see those fiendish forms enter their coffins. He knew then what the crates were. In the dim light, now that he was staring directly into the aperture, he saw what he had noticed before. 3 of those oblong boxes were filled with dank grave earth. He knew then the secret of the unnatural flowers. They had roots. They were rooted in the soil which harboured those undead bodies. Then, like a groping finger, the dawn came out of the sea. Yancey walked to the rail, dazed. It was over now, all over. The orgy was ended. The Golconda was once more an abandoned, rotted hulk. For an hour he stood at the rail, sucking in the warmth and glory of the sunlight. Once again, that wall of unsightly mist was rising out of the water on all sides. Presently it would bury the ship, and Yancey shuddered. He thought of Miggs. With quick steps he paced to the companionway and descended to the lower passage. Hesitantly he prowled through the thickening layers of dank fog. A queer sense of foreboding crept over him. He called out even before he reached the door. There was no answer. Thrusting the barrier open, he stepped across the sill, and then he stood still while a sudden harsh cry broke from his lips. Which was the gutter word there? A sudden harsh cry? Oh, thrusting. Was it thrusting? It was probably thrusting, wasn't it? Thrusting. Miggs was lying there, half across the table, his arms flung out, his head turned grotesquely on its side, staring up at the ceiling. "Miggs! Miggs!" The sound came choking through Yancey's lips. "Oh God, Miggs, what's happened?" "He's dead, mate. I think he's dead." You know, the vampire? Yeah. He reeled forward. Miggs was cold and stiff and quite dead. All the blood was gone out of his face and arms. His eyes were glassy, wide open. He was white as marble, shrunken horribly. In his throat were 2 parallel marks as if a sharp-pointed staple had been hammered into the flesh and then withdrawn. The marks of the vampire. For a long time Yancey did not retreat. The room swayed and lurched before him. He was alone. Alone. The whole ghastly thing was too sudden, too unexpected. Then he stumbled forward and went down on his knees, clawing at Miggs's dangling arm. "Oh God, Miggs," he mumbled incoherently. "You've got to help me. I can't stand it." He clung there, white-faced, staring, sobbing thickly, and presently slumped in a pitiful heap, dragging Miggs over on top of him. It was later afternoon when he regained consciousness. He stood up, fighting away the fear that overwhelmed him. He had to get away. Get away. The thought hammered into his head with monotonous force. Get away. He found his way to the upper deck. There was nothing he could do for Miggs. He would have to leave him here. Stumbling, he moved along the rail and reached down to draw the small boat closer, where he could provision it and make it ready for his departure. His fingers clutched emptiness. The ropes were gone. The dory was gone. He hung limp, staring down at a flat expanse of oily sea. For an hour he did not move. He fought to throw off his fear long enough to think of a way out. Then he stiffened with a sudden jerk and pulled himself away from the rail. The ship's boats offered the only chance. He groped to the nearest one and laboured feverishly over it. But the task was hopeless. The lifeboats were of metal and rusted through and through, wedged in their davits. Possibly davits. The wire cables were knotted and unmovable. He tore his hands on them, wringing blood from his scarred fingers. Even while he worked, he knew that the boats would not float. They were rotten through and through. He had to stop at last from exhaustion. After that, knowing there was no escape, he had to do something, anything, to keep sane. First he would clear those horrible bones from the deck, then explore the rest of the ship. It was a repulsive task, but he drove himself to it. If he could get rid of the bones, perhaps Stragella and the other two creatures will not return. Oh, okay, yeah. Jerking himself erect, I've just noticed that. He did not know. It was merely a faint hope, something to cling to. With grim, tight-pressed lips, he dragged the bleached skeletons over the deck and kicked them over the side, and stood watching them as they sank from sight. Then he went to the hold, smothering his terror, and descended into the gloomy belly of the vessel. He avoided the crates with a shudder of revulsion. Ripping up that evil vine thing by the roots, he carried it to the rail and flung it away with the mould of grave earth still clinging to it. After that, he went over the entire ship, end to end, but found nothing. He gripped the anchor chains then, in the hopes that the ship would drift away from that... he slipped the anchor chains then, in the hope that the ship would drift away from that vindictive bank of fog. Then he paced back and forth, muttering to himself and trying to force courage for the most hideous task of all. The sea was growing dark, and with dusk came increasing terror. He knew the Golconda was drifting. He knew too that the undead inhabitants of the vessel were furious at him for allowing the boat to drift away from their source of food. Or they would be furious when they came alive again after their interim of forced sleep. And there was only one method of defeating them. It was a horrible method, and he was already frightened. Nevertheless, he searched the deck for a marlin spike, and found one. And turning sluggishly, he went back to the hold. A stake, driven through the heart of each of the horrible trio. The rickety stairs were deep in shadow. Already the dying sun, buried beneath its wreath of evil fog, was a ring of bloody mist. He glanced at it, and realised that he must hurry. He cursed himself for having waited so long. It was hard, lowering himself in the pitch-black hold when he could only feel his footing and trust to fate. His boots scraped ominously on the steps. He held his hand above him, gripping the deck timbers, and suddenly he slipped. His foot caught on the edge of a lower step, twisted abruptly, and pitched him forward. He cried out. The marlin spike dropped from his hand and clattered on one of the crates below. He tumbled in a heap, clawing for support. The impact knocked something out of his belt, and he realised, even as his head came into sharp contact with the foremost oblong box, that the Bible, which had heretofore protected him, was no longer a part of him. He did not lose complete control of his senses. Frantically he sought to regain his knees and groped for the black book in the grim of the hold. A sobbing, choking sound came pitifully from his lips. A soft, triumphant laugh came out of the darkness close to him. He swung about heavily, so heavily that the movement sent him sprawling again in an inert heap. He was too late. She was already there on her knees, glaring at him hungrily. A peculiar bluish glow welled about her face. She was ghastly beautiful as she reached behind her into the oblong crate and began to trace a circle about the Bible with a chunk of soft, tarry, pitch-like substance clutched in her white fingers. Yancy stumbled towards her, finding strength in desperation. She straightened to meet him. Her lips curled back, exposed white teeth, her arms coiled out, enveloping him, stifling his struggles. God, they were strong. He could not resist them. The same languid, resigned feeling came over him. He would have fallen, but she held him erect. Yeah, there we go with erect again. She did not touch him with her lips. Behind her, he saw two other shapes take form in the darkness. The savage features of Papa Bosito glowered at him, and Serafino's ratty, smouldering eyes, full of hunger, bored into him. Stragella was obviously afraid of them. Yancy was lifted from his feet. He was carried out on deck and borne swiftly, easily down the companionway along the lower passage, through a swirling blanket of hellish fog and darkness to the cabin where Miggs lay dead, and he lost consciousness while they carried him. He could not tell when he opened his eyes how long he had been asleep. It seemed a long, long interlude. Stragella was sitting beside him. He lay on the bunk in the cabin, and the lamp was burning on his table, revealing Miggs's limp body in full detail. Yancy reached up fearfully to touch his throat. There were no marks there, not yet. He was aware of voices then. Papa Bosito, and the ferret-faced woman were arguing with the girl beside him. The savage old man in particular was being angered by her cool, possessive smile. "We are drifting away from the prison isles," Papa Bosito snarled, glancing at Yancy with unmasked hate. "It is his work, lifting the anchor. Unless you share him with us until we drift ashore, we shall perish." "He's mine," Stragella shouted, modulating her voice to a persuasive whisper. "You had the other. This one is mine. I shall have him." "He belongs to us all." "Why?" Stragella smiled. "Because he is looked upon the resurrection night? Ah, he is the first to learn our secret." Serafino's eyes narrowed at that, almost to pinpoint. She jerked forward, clutching the girl's shoulder. "We have quarrelled enough," she hissed. "Soon it will be daylight. He belongs to us all because he has taken away from the Isles and learned our secrets." The words drilled their way into Yancey's brain. The resurrection night. There was an ominous significance in it, and he thought he knew its meaning. His eyes or his face must have revealed his thoughts, for Papacito drew near to him and pointed into his face with a long bony forefinger, muttering triumphantly. "You have seen what no other eyes have seen," the ancient man growled bitterly. "Now for that you shall become one of us. Stragella wants you. She shall have you for eternity, for a life without death. Do you know what that means?" Yancey shook his head, dumbly, fearfully. "We are the undead," Mosito leered. "Our victims become creatures of the blood, like us. At night we are free. During the day we must return to our graves. That is why." He cast his arm towards the upper deck in a hideous gesture. "Those other victims of ours have not yet become like us. They were never buried. They have no graves to return to. Each night we give them life for our own amusement, but they are not of the Brotherhood. Yet." Yancey licked his lips and said nothing. He understood then. Every night it happened. A nightly pantomime when the dead become alive again, reenacting the events of the night when the Golconda had become a ship of hell. "We are gypsies," the old man gloated. "Once we were human, living in our pleasant little camp, in the shadow of Pobiedzin Potok's crusty peaks in the Morava Valley of Serbia. And it was the time of Milutin, 600 of years ago. Then the vampires of the hills came for us and took us to them. We lived the undead life until there was no more blood in the valley. So we went to the coast, we three, transporting our grave earth with us. And we lived there, alive by night and dead by day, in the coastal villages of the Black Sea, until the time came when we wished to go to the far places." Serafino's guttural voice interrupted him, saying harshly, "Hurry! It is nearly dawn." "And we obtained passage on this Golconda, arranging to have our crates of grave earth carried secretly to the hold. And the ship fell into cholera and starvation and storm. She went aground, and here we are. Ah, but there is blood upon the island, my pretty one, and so we anchored the Golconda on the reef, where life was close at hand." Yancey closed his eyes with a shudder. He did not understand all of the words, for they were in a jargon gypsy tongue, but he knew enough to horrify him. Then the old man ceased gloating. He fell back, glowering at Stragella. As the girl laughed, a mad, cackling, triumphant laugh of possession. She leaned forward, and the movement brought her out of the line of lamplight, so the feeble glow fell full over Yancey's prostrate body. At that, with an angry snarl, she recoiled. Her eyes went wide with abhorrence. Upon his chest gleamed the crucifix. Chekhov's crucifix. The tattooed cross and saviour which had been indelibly printed there. Stragella held her face away, shielding her eyes. She cursed him horribly. Backing away, she seized the arms of her companions and pointed with a trembling finger to the thing which had repulsed her. The fog seemed to seep deeper and deeper into the cabin during the ensuing silence. Yancey struggled to a sitting posture and cringed back against the wall, waiting for them to attack him. It would be finished in a moment, he knew. Then he would join Miggs, with those awful marks on his throat, and Stragella's lips crimson with his sucked blood. But they held their distance. The fog envelopment made them almost indistinct. He could see only 3 pairs of glaring, staring, phosphorescent eyes that grew larger and wider and more intensely terrible. He buried his face in his hands, waiting. They did not come. He heard them mumbling, whispering. Vaguely he was conscious of another sound, far off and barely audible. The Howl of Wolves. Beneath him the bunk was swaying from side to side with the movement of the ship. The Golconda was drifting, swiftly. A storm had risen out of nowhere, and the wind was singing its dead dirge in the rotted spars high above decks. He could hear it moaning, wheezing, like a human being in torment. Then the 3 pairs of glittering orbs moved nearer. The whispered voices ceased, and a cunning smile passed over Stragella's features. Yancey screamed and fluttered against the wall. He watched her in fascination as she crept upon him. One arm was flung across her eyes to protect them from the sight of the crucifix, and the other hand outstretched, groping ever nearer. She clutched that hellish chunk of pitch-like substance with which she had encircled the Bible. He knew what she would do. The thought struck him like an icy blast full of fear and madness. She would slink closer, closer until her hand touched his flesh. Then she would place the black substance around the tattooed cross and kill its powers. His defence would be gone. Then, those cruel lips on the throat. There was no avenue of escape. Papa Bosito and the plump old woman, grinning malignantly, had slid to one side between him and the doorway, and Stragella writhed forward with one alabaster arm, feeling. He was conscious of the roar of surf, very close, very loud, outside. The walls of the fog-filled enclosure. Flog? The ship was lurching, reeling heavily, pitching in the swell. Hours must have passed, hours and hours of darkness and horror. Then she touched him. The sticky stuff was hot on his chest, moving in a slow circle. He hurled himself back, stumbled, went down, and she fell upon him. Under his tormented body, the floor of the cabin split asunder. The ship buckled from top to bottom with a grinding, roaring impact. A terrific shock burst through the ancient hulk, shattering its rotted timbers. The lamp careened off the table, plunging the cabin into semi-darkness. Through the portholes filtered a grey glare. Stragella's face, thrust into Yancey's, became a mask of beautiful fury. She whirled back. She stood rigid, screaming lividly to Papa Bosito and the old hag. Go back, she wailed. We have waited too long. It is dawn. She ran across the floor, grappling with them. Her lips were distorted, her body trembled. She hurled her companions to the door. Then, as she followed them into the gloom of the passage, she turned upon Yancey with one last unholy snarl of defeated rage. And she was gone. Yancey lay limp. When he struggled to his feet at last and went on deck, the sun was high in the sky, lighted and crimson, struggling to penetrate the cone of fog which swirled about the ship. The ship lay far over, careened on her side. 100 yards distant over the port rail lay the heaven-sent sight of land, a bleak, vacant expanse of jungle-rimmed shoreline. Wind in the gutter, yeah. He went deliberately to work. In fairness, it was like him, and she was going to smear a hot substance on his chest. He went deliberately to work, a task that had to be finished quickly, lest he be discovered by the inhabitants of the shore and be considered stark mad. Returning to the cabin, he took the oil lamp and carried it to the open hold. There, sprinkling the liquid over the ancient wood, he set fire to it. Nuke the site from orbit, it's the only way to be sure. Turning, he stepped to the rail. A scream of agony, unearthly and prolonged, rose up behind him. Then he was over the rail, battling in the surf. When he staggered up on the beach 20 minutes later, the Golconda was a roaring furnace. On all sides of her, the flames snarled skyward, spewing through that hellish cone of vapour. Grimly, Yancey turned away and trudged along the beach. He looked back after an hour of steady plodding. The lagoon was empty. The fog had vanished. The sun gleamed down with a warm brilliance on a broad, empty expanse of sea. Hours later, he reached a settlement. Men came and talked to him and asked curious questions. They pointed to his hair, which was stark white. They told him he... Guess he's getting this... Somebody hit 0 hit points. They told him he had reached Port Blair on the southern island of the Andamans. After that, noticing the peculiar gleam of his bloodshot eyes, they took him to the home of the governor. There he told his story, told hesitantly because he expected to be disbelieved and mocked. The governor looked at him cryptically. You don't expect me to understand? The governor said. I'm not so sure, sir. This is a penal colony, a prison isle. Colonialism. During the past few years, more than 200 of our convicts have died in the most curious way. 2 tiny punctures in the throat. Loss of blood. You must destroy the graves, Yancey muttered. The governor nodded silently, significantly. After that, Yancey returned to the world alone. Always alone. Men peered into his face and shrank away from the haunted stare of his eyes. They saw the crucifix upon his chest and wondered why, day and night, he wore his shirt flapping open, so that the brilliant design glared forth. But their curiosity was never appeased. Only Yancey knew, and Yancey was silent. There we go. Right, I will actually look at that Wikipedia article about Hugh B. Cave now. Huh. Oh, he died in 2004. R.I.P. Hugh B. Cave, I guess. Then things. Right, okay. I'll stop reading Wikipedia article on the stream. Thank you very much, everybody. I hope you have enjoyed the purple prose of Edgar Allan Poe and the schlocky horror of Hugh B. Cave and the very brief interlude of Richard Matheson's son. I am going to head to bed now. At 1 minute to 10. Was well timed. I will, again, 2 weeks' time, assuming nothing else stops me, I will proceed on through the Vampire Marathon. My 10 o'clock alarm, which I should remember to turn off for these things. Yes, I do this alternate weeks, as you know. And so in 2 weeks' time, we will be on to... next two are A Week in the Unlife and The House at Evening. Oh no, I'll do 3 next week because the next two are quite short. A Week in the Unlife, The House at Evening, and Labyrinth I will do next week. And Labyrinth is very long, but quite good. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed yourself. And I will head off now. And remember, good night out there, whatever you are.